Good morning. Thank you all for coming out and joining us today. My name is Chelsea Hamilton, and I am the Early Learning Program Planner with Clackamas County Children, Family, and Community Solutions. We're on the third floor of this building. We have the Early Learning Hub of Clackamas County, and we have the Parenting Hub, Clackamas Parenting Together. So there's some flyers on the back table about some of our upcoming programs for any of you who do work with small children. But we know we've got a great group of different individuals here, all of you working in different ways with the families in our community. So thank you for joining us for our presentation. Logistic wise, if you haven't been to this building and you're looking for the bathrooms, you go back out to the main area where the welcome desk is, and by the staircase is where the bathrooms are. If anybody here is part of the Oregon Registry and is interested in Step 2 credit, be sure you stay after the presentation and we can get you a certificate for that. If those words don't make sense to you, then please just be on your way at the end of this presentation. I am welcoming today Aoife Rose Magee. She is the Parenting Hub coordinator down in Lynn Benton County, and so we're really excited that us in Clackamas, we get to kind of partner with some of our folks down in the middle of the state. She is a master trainer and does presentations throughout the area, and definitely has a passion for self-care and caring for ourselves and making sure that we are doing our best to not just care for others, but take care of who we are as well. So welcome.
Thank
Thank you.
you. Yes, and welcome everyone here. I'm excited that so many of you came out today. It really tells me that this is a time when we're starting to think about our own needs in the context of the work that we do. This presentation was developed a couple of years ago out of a need in my own life. What I started to realize was that I was really deeply, deeply tired. And I started thinking, am I depressed? Because life was going pretty well for me. But I was feeling this deep sense of fatigue. And I realized I just was doing too much. There's a way in which when you care and you're passionate about your life, that you fill it. You fill your morning, noons, and evenings with all the things that you want to do. And I was doing a lot. And so I realized if I was going to continue to be of service and give my gifts, then I needed to be a whole lot better at making sure that I had a little bit more time for me and my family. I've worked with families for 30 years in various capacities. I started my career actually working in geriatrics, primarily with hospice and end of life care and memory care, people who had Alzheimer's or related dementias. And what I noticed at that time in my life is that the people who were worst at self care were the doctors, nurses, social workers, and caregivers. Some of the residents were doing just fine, but we were all falling apart, right? And then when I got pregnant and had my son Zach, who's 19, just started college at Northwestern, is just a gem of a human being. I realized if you really want to change the trajectory of a human life, you really have to start at the beginning. And so I went back to school and got my master's and my PhD, both in early intervention, so working in early childhood, but more with special needs. But what I realized is a lot of individuals show up as having special needs because of the relationships and the environments that they're in. And so what I realize is if we want children to thrive and we want parents to thrive and we want our staff to thrive, there's a way in which we need to be better at taking care of ourselves or else we'll just burn out. Now, Chelsea's going to help me with a little bit of mic holding because it's a large room. I want everybody to be able to hear. So I'm going to pose a couple of questions to you. And if you're willing to answer, you can do so. But what I'd like you to do is first turn to a neighbor and on a scale of 1 to 5, come up with a number of where you think you're at with your own stress today. Do you feel like you're doing pretty well? So like high five, I'm feeling good. Or maybe stress is really, really a big issue. And I guess we should reverse that. So 5 would be high stress. and 0 would be I'm good. Okay? So just take a moment to turn to someone next to you. Scale of 1 to 5. All right, let's go ahead and come back together. So if you could raise your hand, scale of 1 to 5, where do you think you're at right now? 3s, 1s, 4s, 1s, 4. Okay, so we have a real mix. 5s, 4s. Okay. So that's really important information because much like I was starting to tell you earlier about how I was feeling that deep sense of fatigue, it was important for my journey to actually own that, own my fatigue, recognize I was having it, and try to then start from there to figure out what I was going to do about it. So today we're going to talk a lot about stress and burnout, but we're also going to talk about ways that we can cope, manage, and balance our lives so that we're not feeling the overwhelm of the symptoms of it. So now I want you to turn to the person next to you, and again, on a scale of 1 to 5, let them know how well are you coping with your stress. So some of you 1s, I would imagine, are going to be 5s. I got this. I'm doing great. And some of you 4s and 5s might be, oh, I could really use some strategies, right? So again, just a moment. Turn to your neighbor and come up with a number. All right, let's come back together again. So again, show of hands. So 5 is I got this. High five me. I'm doing great. So we got a 5 there. 4s, 4s, 3s and 2s. So, and I would imagine for some of you that are holding up 3s, it might be contextual or relative. Maybe this morning you're not feeling too bad and you're here at a conference or a workshop to talk about your self-care. So maybe, oh, that I'm really working on it, right? But for those of you who maybe are on the lower part of the number, hopefully today you're going to leave with even more ideas for what you can do. Because, the truth of it is, we are living at a time in history where all of us, whether we're caregivers or not, are hurried and we're harried. And for those of you who do work in early childhood, please raise your hand. Who's hanging out with kiddos? Families? So, the question that I ask a lot of teachers that I work with and a lot of practitioners who are in the field is, are kids different today? Are we seeing some changes? Would you say that they are? One of the things that I've really heard a lot about is that behavior is off the chart. The kids are throwing things and hiding under tables and, just having all of these really serious behavioral concerns. And if you really trace back the roots of all behavior, underneath it is a stress response. All the research is starting to show that when the human is stressed, it goes into one of 3 F responses. You guys know what those are, right? Fight, flight, or freeze. And so, what some of the information we're starting to learn is even during pregnancy, when the fetus is forming, some kids are getting very stressed out because of what? Mom stress, right? High cortisol levels of moms. And so the fetus goes into one of those 3 F responses. And when they come out, they're already primed to be in a world in a very overreactive stress response system. That's kind of a big idea, right? But if you look at the 3 types of temperament we see in children, what do we have? Feisty, fearful, and flexible. Well, feisty sounds an awful lot like flight to me, right? And fearful sounds an awful lot like freeze or What am I missing? Fight, flight, or freeze. So flight or freeze for some of these issues. And so whether we're little and not even born, or whether we're big like we are right now, when we're stressed, we kind of get overcome with these big issues, right? And so if we don't find some strategies to manage them, it can kind of wreak havoc in our life. And so for some of us, when we're stressed, we internalize, right? What does internalize behavior look like? Usually we shut down, right? And so some of that's anxiety, depression, feeling kind of in a negative mood. And then what's externalizing behavior when you're stressed? Acting out. And so what are we seeing in kids today? A lot of acting out, a lot of disengagement, a lot of defiance, right? So what we're really seeing, and if we have our hearts and minds open, is we're seeing little ones who are kind of barometers of big ones, right? So they're just telling us, wow, we're overwhelmed. And so you can only imagine what their daily experiences are like. And so as teachers and parents and members of the village, it behooves all of us to try to model and support those around us, either the littles or the bigs, because we're all in it together, right? So let's do a little bit more reflection with your neighbors. You're going to get to know your neighbors pretty well this morning. So I have a couple of questions. Now, I know some of you don't work with children, so you can adapt this however you see fit. Maybe just think in your own lives and your own work, how do you experience stress and burnout? And what are some of the common causes of it? And we'll talk about that. But before you share, can anybody tell me the difference between stress and burnout? Is there a difference? Do you mind talking into the mic?
Stress is if you can feel stress and manage it, but burnout's when you're not managing the stress, right? When you're
Okay,
not taking care of yourself.
excellent. So stress, you're still in the game. You're still trying, right? You're working harder. In fact, a little stress is not a bad thing at all, right? It makes you run a little faster and move a little more uh, focused. But too much, then we kind of shut down, right? There's too much of a good thing of anything is probably problematic. So burnout is really a point where you need a break. You need to do something else. You really shouldn't be doing what you're doing. Um, and it's okay to be in that place, but it's also really important then to find a way forward. So why don't you, with your neighbor, we'll take just a few minutes and think about in your own work, in your own lives, how do you experience stress? And if you are in burnout, that's okay too. But how's that looking? For me, it was very much a deep state of tiredness and fatigue. And also, what are some of the common causes? And if you do work with children, what specifically might be related to the field, like what you're up against in your work, in your daily life, that may be causing some of this difficulty? Okay? I'll call you back in just a couple of minutes. Okay, let's bring our attention back together. We could probably spend a lot of time talking about the causes of stress. Would a couple of people be willing to highlight a few of the things that they came up with in their discussions? Please. Chelsea's going to give you the mic if that's okay. I can paraphrase if that's more comfortable for people.
Usually my stress comes from having more to do than I have time to do it.
Ah,
That would be the biggest thing, I think. Sometimes I'm stressed by what my children are doing or not doing because I'm concerned about them. They're not young. And the other would be sometimes if I have a job or something I need to do that I don't feel that I can do it well enough.
okay. Right. Is that because of skills or resources or?
Probably skills.
Okay. Those are great. And does anyone else relate to that? So we have worrying about, having enough time, worrying about relationships. That's a big one. If you're a sensitive soul and empathic at all, and especially if you have kids of your own, you care a lot, right? And then how well prepared are we to meet the challenges before us? Those are huge. Other people, other ideas. Please.
I get stressed in addition to that just when I see a problem and I don't have any control over how to fix it.
Yeah, that's very stressful to not have a sense of control. And not surprisingly, the literal diagnoses of like OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, is a real attempt for people to have control over things they can't be in control over. And it's like off the charts on the number of people trying to manage, right? So thank you. Yeah, so not always feeling in control. Anyone relate to that? Probably all of us. Yep. Other ideas, please.
Despair of the unknown. Yeah. My husband was recently diagnosed with Parkinson's, so I
Mm.
am terrified of what is ahead and scared that I won't be able to handle it.
Yes.
So just
Yeah.
how to take care of both of us in this new journey.
Right. Right. And the interesting thing I've really come to in my years of practice and just journeying in the world is I've never met one person who didn't have some lemons. Do you know what I mean by that? Lemons are the hard things in life that are a little sour. Not one. But how we manage or cope or get the resources we need to meet the challenge is everything. So, in the lemonade metaphor, what are we trying to do? Maybe get some sugar, make some lemon tarts, some lemonade, whatever we can, because sometimes our hardest moments are where we learn the most, too. That's kind of the dirty little secret about stress, because sometimes if we're not stressed, it also means we're not growing. So, a little bit kind of wakes us up in our life and says, okay, I got some things to figure out and take care of. Too much, though, and it's like, it feels like the weight of the world's on our shoulders. So there is a balance in there somewhere. Maybe one more. Does anyone else have?
Responsibility. Feel responsible for so many people. Like I have young kids. I work with volunteers. I feel responsible for them. I feel responsible for the kids that they work with. Just like all of this responsibility. Just
Yeah.
feel like this real sense of responsibility that feels stressful.
Yeah. So the stress of feeling responsible for others. Yeah. That actually is a good segue into shifting to the next piece. And that's part of the reason also why I developed this workshop and started doing the real personal work is because I realized the only way forward was to take responsibility for my life. And when we start exploring how you can do that better, it's extremely empowering, it turns out. But some of you are mentioning when we're stressed, we often feel out of control. We don't know what to do. We feel upset. And that's what the brain does when it's in that part of it that's in the reactive state, right? We're confused, we don't know, we're often sad or angry, but most of it's we're just afraid. And so part of what I hope we do today is, shift some of that stress reaction and be much more purposeful in taking the steps that we need to feel better. Sound like a good plan? All right. So, part of my journey was I needed to go back into my childhood. Now, I'm not going to make this a therapy session, but I will say this. When I was a little girl, I was from fairly humble beginnings, but it also meant that I had a lot of freedom. And so I was the kid with like cut off jean shorts, barefoot up in the tree for hours. Like that was my day. And my very favorite thing to do was art. And so I always had my like pad and my pencils, and it was super fun for me. And over the course of time, when I started to realize, wow, I just don't feel good. I just don't feel like things are working for me. And it dawned on me, when's the last time I did anything creative, right? Because when we're feeling responsible, when we're working really hard, when we're doing all the things that we need to do, what side of our brain are we usually engaging? Our left side. And it's a very good side. It's very important to be logical and analytical and all the things we ascribe to that part. But if we're not in the other side of our brain, then we really lose some of our potential for empathy with other people. being creative and making good decisions and problem solving, but from a place of knowing and intuition more than have tos and shoulds. Do you understand the distinction? And sometimes you need big picture and you need to have some skills and knowledge, but we also have to trust ourselves, and often we don't. Especially when we're just tired or busy or hurried, then we're often check our to-do list, check, 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 if we can, right? If we can take anything off. Sometimes I get to the end of my day, it's like, what did I get accomplished today? I felt really busy though. So, in order to really create balance, we have to start within ourselves in realizing there is a whole part of our being that has to have expression. And that's whatever it means to you. Now, music lives in the right side, art, dance, movement, like all the things that actually, if you ask a shaman, what they do when someone in the village is depressed, the 4 questions they ask. When did you stop dancing? When did you stop creating? When did you stop enjoying stories? Right? All of the richness that comes with that part of the world. And so, what I started to realize is that for me personally, I need a paintbrush periodically and a couple of hours. And that will do me more good than almost anything. And so, with that in mind, I actually signed up for an online art class, and I've been really enjoying it. I do it when I have time, it's not a lot of pressure. We upload photos to each other, and it's a really fun online community. But I had a woman say to me once, who was a parent educator, and she was kind of coaching me in my role doing that with families. And she said, the biggest lesson most people need is you need to learn to be planful so you can be playful. So, in that way, we do need our left side. We need to think it through. We need a plan. We need goals. We need to know what we need in our lives. But we also need to sometimes leave room for just being. A lot of the research for early childhood right now is that kids are way overstructured and they're not thriving, right? Every day, every minute of their day is planned and they're not doing well in those environments. So, what do they need? Just free play, right? Well, it turns out adults need that too. So leave room for that. Leave room for opportunities, because if we really want to get out of our stressful states, we need to be able to relax. And for most of us, relaxing means puttering and not filling in all the moments. I went to see this guy that I've done some body work with over the years, and he's starting to retire. And I said, "So what are you doing with all your extra time?" He's like, "Nothing. I'm just puttering." Good for you, right? And that's great. That's great. So, one of the things that's coming out of the research around stress, too, is this idea of resilience, especially for individuals or children who've had trauma or really big things happen. How would you define it? Have some of you heard this word before? Anyone want to give it a good shot for a definition? Okay. So she said ability to cope. And I think that's a pretty good one. So if you look at how it's actually defined in the research, this is a lot of words to say just what she said. A process by which humans in adverse circumstances evade predicted negative impacts and emerge healthy or successful in life. So that's a lot of mumbo jumbo, which basically says if bad things happen, you find a way to move forward in a good way. And so, what we are starting to learn about the human condition is there's no way to avoid the lemons. I mean, I wish there were, and maybe there's some ways to minimize them, but life happens, right? People get sick, kids are running amok, like whatever happens, like, there are things that are weighing on us. So we can't necessarily get away from all of it. And to be honest, we probably wouldn't want to if we understand all the good that comes from our experiences. And that's kind of the unfortunate thing about life is in order to really learn all your lessons, sometimes you're challenged. But we don't want people to crumble and be overwhelmed by those experiences. We want them to do okay. So, in the resilience research for early childhood, there's one thing that kids need to be resilient. They can't do it alone necessarily. Anyone know what that one thing is? Yeah, so they need a support person. And so it turns out you can have a child in a really stressful environment that's pretty hard. And some of the kids I know, not easy. However, if they have one person they can turn to buffer them and mitigate some of that, they do okay. And that's true of us too. If we have someone that we can go talk to or connect with and say, hey, this is really, really hard. I need some support, we do better too. There's a curriculum, the Circle of Security. Some of you may have heard of it or work with it, right? There's that whole kids need to feel like they have a stable base in the parent so they can go explore the world and then come back and charge back up like a cell phone. But we need that too, right? So when I work with parents, I ask them one question, and it doesn't matter what their answer is. I say, if the worst happens at 4 a.m., who are you going to call? And it's okay if they don't necessarily have somebody, but then their primary goal right after that is to go figure out who it could be. It might be a neighbor, it might be a coworker, it might be who knows who it would be, maybe another parent if they happen to be in a group together. But we are not meant to do this alone. And so if we really want to build resiliency, because we're not always able to control everything as much as we'd like to, we need to figure out what we need, and that's usually relational. Relationships can kind of make or break our lives, right? They can bring us up or bring us down really in a hurry. So we have to figure out who our people are first and foremost. And that's especially true for the stress response. So it turns out there's actually another way of dealing with stress beyond the fight, flight, or freeze. Anybody know what it is? So it's called tend and befriend. So it turns out when there were these women working in a science lab and they were kind of doing some research, when they all got stressed out, what they realized is that they ended up together cleaning up and kind of talking through things and talking about things. And they started to realize that's actually what they need to do is kind of circle the wagons, protect each other, support each other, and in that way address whatever the issue was that was presenting to them. So I love that. I love that response. To me, that feels better than freaking out or falling apart or climbing under a table, although those things can work too in a pinch. So again, I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes, but I'd like you to share with your neighbors, what are some of the adverse conditions or experiences that we face in the world? And if you work with kids, you can talk about that. If you don't, you can adapt it. But I'll get you started before you talk to your neighbor. So can most of you see this picture pretty well? What do you notice about the picture? All right. People are sitting alone. It's the same person. Yeah. So it turns out this is my son, Zach, and he gave me permission to use this. He created this photo of him on a bus, on the city bus, and he's in all these different seats. And the reason why I put this up for myself is like one of you had talked about, there's not enough time. Well, for me, I feel like I'm in like a bazillion places at once, or people expect me to be. So that's one of the biggest challenges for me is like, where am I supposed to be and what hat am I supposed to be wearing? And how does that feel? And sometimes, even in all of the running around and working, I do actually feel pretty solitary, right? I'm in a room full of people, but I'm not necessarily the one that gets to engage. You guys get to engage, and that's okay. I'll engage with Chelsea. But but we need each other, right? We do need each other, and it's important to find those ways. So just a couple of minutes, think about this for yourself. What are those adversities that you feel you're kind of up against in your own work life or personal life? And just a couple of minutes, and I'll call you back together. Okay, let's go ahead and come back together. So could we get a couple of people to share an adverse condition or two? The nice thing about sharing is you really get to speak for others because you're not alone in any of this stuff, right? A lot of people relate to the themes that emerge in the room. Please.
So we face a lot of change beyond our control, whether it's coming um, down through the organization or coming at us from outside of the organization, and can't seem to quite control all of it.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, most of it.
Yeah, yeah. Change can be very stressful, especially when it's imposed. And like someone was saying earlier, if we don't feel like we're ready for it or have the skills for it or the time for it, like all of those things. So change, anyone relate to that one? Changes? Yeah. And it seems like I was talking to Chelsea before. It's like, there's so much in the hub world, all the different things happening for parenting hubs, early learning hubs, all these different systems, is that we have initiative fatigue. Like we just keep doing new stuff, right? And it's like, but I was still working on the old stuff, right? What happened to the old stuff? Yeah. Maybe one other example. Anyone would be willing to share? And if you don't want to use the mic, I can paraphrase for you. No adversity at all? Boy, we can all go home. Please.
We work at a transitional living program, which some may consider just a fancy word for a homeless shelter.
Okay.
And much of the time, these kids are coming from backgrounds of extreme trauma, just about, 100% of the time, I'd say. And it's not just housing situation, it's a betterment program. So the idea is that we want them to participate in the program and try to better themselves through volunteering or working or going to college. And sometimes they're not so receptive to this because no one's set an example for them.
Uh-huh.
So trying to find that happy medium between being stern and caring.
Yeah, that's such a big one, right? And so working with youth is kind of like working with any other human, right? How do we help them be their better selves, especially when maybe they're a little self-destructive or maybe they don't even know what the possibilities are for their own life. So that is hard. That is hard. But hopefully with, like you said, the modeling or encouragement, maybe there is a way to help people move forward. What I find is that people who've had trauma or have a lot of stress, they're not in the part of their brain where they actually can even sort that out. So, how do we help them calm down enough, give them the strategies to take the next step and then the next step, right? So I like what you're saying is like, gosh, you want so much for them and you've seen the challenge in them and then it becomes your challenge in some way to try to help them have a leg up. Yeah, that's so yeah. So for us as caregivers and professionals and just humans, we look around us and the needs have never been greater. I mean, maybe they have. I don't know, but in my career, it seems like things are hard right now. Really, since about 10 years ago when we hit that recession, that really did a number on families. And I still think that for a lot of children and parents, we're still overcoming some of that. And so some of the fallout is higher levels of homelessness, more mental health issues, more depression, right? Like all of the things that are attached to money or not having money. And that can be really hard. Yeah. All right. So let's talk a little bit more about that stuff. So there's a number of terms coming out in the field now about how we are impacted by the difficulties that we're witnessing. So some of us have had our own trauma. That's very real. But it turns out we can be traumatized by hearing about other people's trauma. That's a big thought, huh? And so, if we're sensitive to the stories, and there are many that come through the news, come through our caseloads, come through our classrooms, um, it can start to feel a little heavy, right? And so, the term for that is vicarious trauma, which, as I've described, it's when we feel very traumatized by holding the space for others who are having some really dire situations. And then what happens over time as you do that a lot and you're giving a lot, and if you're sensitive and compassionate, you're giving everything you got usually, you bump up against what I was suffering from, and that's compassion fatigue. You get tired of just holding that space because it hurts your heart, like it literally does, right? A lot of people who have heart conditions are very caring people. And when you grieve, that there's a very physical response to life when that happens. And so feeling compassion for others takes its toll. And then, as was mentioned a couple of times now, sometimes there are variables beyond our control. And that's hard, right? And so there's ways in which a lot's being asked of us, even on the best of days, even if everything, all the stars are aligned in other ways. Just the work that we do with humans is potentially gonna be a challenge. So when we think about our role and how we show up in life with others, usually we have some thoughts and beliefs about what that means. And so I'm going to have you share again with the people around you. But here are some prompts, and you can pick some or modify them a little bit for your needs. But what do you think about your role to others? Like, how does that fit for you? Is that okay? Right? Like, do you want to be a caregiver if you are a caregiver? Or do you feel like um, you really find value in your work? Like, for me, when I shifted from geriatrics to early childhood, I did that really knowingly. Like, I realized the people I cared for in the nursing home back in New York, which is where I grew up, a lot of them had a lot of mental and physical health problems because of their journey, because of their early beginnings, because of the traumas that they suffered, and a lack of support and skill building. And so I realized if I really want to change outcomes, I need to start at the beginning, really. And so I care deeply about kids because of that. And so, do I think it's important? Yeah, it's really important from my perspective. Um, but are there others that maybe challenge your values and beliefs? Like if you look at early childhood and education in general, is it well funded? Not usually, right? That's starting to change. But there are different ways in which what we care deeply about doesn't always feel supported by the larger world. If you think about, and I love sports as much as the next person, but is it really okay that someone gets millions of dollars for playing and little kids can't get millions of dollars for playing, right? Like there's a disconnect there somewhere. So you can talk about that. But I want to share a little story that kind of illustrates this too. I was doing some consulting work down in Veneta, which is a little community outside of Eugene. And I had an in-home provider talk to me about how, she just felt like her families were constantly challenging what she was doing with the kids. They had different requests, wanted different things, wanted, you know, different focus. And she finally realized that what she needed to do was very upfront say to the families, this is why I do what I do. If you choose to have your child here, this is what you can expect. If this feels like a good fit for you, then I'd love to work with you. But if not, let me help you find a place that's better suited to what you're looking for. And so for her, she was very into like constructivism and play based learning. And all the richness that goes with that. And some of the families are so worried about like getting the kids ready for school that they wanted it to be much more classroom like. And so that's a philosophical difference, and we could talk about that all morning if you want. But um, so for her, what she really valued and believed in, she had to kind of get to a place where she could stand up and say, "Hey, this is what I have to offer, and I really want to offer this. But if you need something else, maybe you can find it in a different provider," which is very empowering, right? But for a long time, she just felt terrible, like she was being judged and criticized and wasn't doing her job well. But she was doing a great job, right? So again, let's take a few minutes and share with your neighbor, what's your thinking around kind of how you're showing up, how that's received, what's important for you and all of that with your values. Okay? And I'll call you back in a few minutes. Okay, let's come back together. So do you guys like this image? I came across this image and I'm like, oh, I love this, because things that really feel like barriers don't need to be forever. We can switch those up. So would anyone like to share a little bit about this, or do you want to just leave it in your small group discussion? It's fine. This is a really important opportunity to really reflect on, why do you do what you do, right? I did this one workshop up in Multnomah County, and it was on temperament. It was, just early childhood stuff. And at the end, I asked participants, what are they going to take from the information, and how are they going to use it? And these two girls in the back that had been talking the whole time, usually I get really upset about side talking, but it's like, what's going on with those two? And they said, we're changing our job. And I'm like, what? And they're like, yeah, we realize we're just not a good fit for our director. So we're going to find some other place where we think we could be happier. And I'm like, you go for it. That's awesome, right? And so, sometimes we have to look and say, is this the right fit for us? Why are we doing what we do? But it doesn't mean that we should leave if it's hard. Sometimes that's the very reason to stay. But we have to know what our values are, so that when things are hard, we can know why we're doing what we're doing and kind of keep the faith with that. So, all right. So let's keep moving forward around this idea, with the idea that we will have challenges. There's no question, and we should have challenges. Challenges are a good thing. It makes us learn new things and get smarter and grow in all kinds of ways, predicted and unpredicted. But in order to do that, what we need to do is really focus on the things that we do have control of, which is, we absolutely have the ability to learn new things and gain new skills. So even just being here today, you're probably learning things about yourself, from me, from each other, from your own process. But sometimes we do need to ask somebody who has very specific skills. Like if we don't know how to do a budget, we should talk to somebody that has those number skills, right? If we don't know how to take care of a kid who's like screaming every day at 3 o'clock, we need someone to help us figure out what's going on. That actually happened, by the way. Anyone know what was going on that caused him to scream every day at 3? No, he was hungry, or the new term, hangry. He was hangry. He was a really active kid, and he burned a lot of calories, and he didn't really eat very well at lunchtime. And so by 3 o'clock, this kid was like really, really distressed. But knowing something about uh, the child and observation and strategies can really help when we're dealing with something that's hard. The final one, I used to think wasn't something we had a lot of control over. We kind of are who we are. But is that true? Can we change our dispositions? I've come to realize we can. I've come to realize that it's actually the one thing that usually is a game changer in our life, is if we can change our attitude and how we feel about things, right? And so, I mean, granted, there are probably some people out there that shouldn't work with kids. Like, it just really is not where they're going to thrive, and they should know that. But for the most part, we find places where things work for us, right? And going back to the temperament dialogue, I was doing a parenting class, and I had a mom show up one night, and she was so stressed. And I'm like, "What's going on with you?" And she's like, "Oh, my daughter is going into kindergarten, and I have to decide, kind of what schools to look at and where she's going to go. And this is a kid who's really active, really, really active. And she's like, if I put her into like a public school, she's just going to like not do well." And so we started talking. It's like, are there other schools where kids can be more active and self-directed? And another parent said, my kid goes to Montessori, which is very much that kind of constructivist environment. And so suddenly it was like, oh, maybe there's other options than you were thinking. So these are things that are opportunities. So much like the gal I told you about who started to tell people her philosophy on how she was going to educate the children and work with the children in her care, sometimes we have to figure out, what is it that we need to learn more about? What do we need to know? So whatever your challenges are, write them down, and then next to them, start brainstorming what might help those things. I was doing a different activity with another group, and there was this one woman, I just adore her, and she said, her greatest challenge was saying no. She couldn't say no. And that's a problem, right? And so what she started realizing is that she was missing out on a lot of her own family stuff and her own personal interests because she was always taking care of other people or doing things for other people. And someone said to her, what if every no you say to someone else is a yes to you? Like, what if you can change being a yes person, but keep yourself in mind? And suddenly it was like, oh my gosh, I'm going to completely try this. And I ran into her a few months later, and it was totally working for her. So sometimes it's just figuring it out, right? Like, where are our obstacles, usually within ourselves, and how are we going to overcome them? And that can really help. So when I started the job I have now at the hub, I went into this environment. I'm very social, I love to chit chat, love to inspire. Like, I have that kind of a personality. And I went into an environment with all like, be at your desk, eat at your desk, keep your head down. Um, and I'm like, this is really not going to work for me. I wasn't really sure what I was going to do, but I realized in talking with them, it wasn't that they didn't enjoy fun. They just didn't know how to like initiate it or have it. And they're like, well, if you want to have more fun and more socializing, you're going to have to bring it on and be the fun director. And so I'm like, all right, I'll take that challenge. And so we just started doing potlucks and, little things here and there. And then all of a sudden, they were bringing in baked goods and, giving people little gifts. And people were starting to walk together outside the office. And so sometimes you have to be the change. Who said that? Gandhi? Be the change that you want to see in the world. And so the expert advice is, if you want a different experience, you need to create a different mindset. But sometimes we need to take that one step further, and we actually have to create a different environment. So I want to share with you some of the ways in which we can do that. So it turns out we are way better at self-care when we're in environments where people care about that sort of thing. And so if you're with a group of people and people aren't necessarily doing good self-care, you're going to have a conversation about that. So in my office, we talked about how maybe sitting at our desks all day was hurting our bodies, and it does, right? We're all of us, we're like middle-aged women, like with neck pain, back pain. We're all getting physical therapy at one point or another because it turns out, they say, sitting is the new smoking. And so there are ways in which we need to walk more, move more, stretch more, all of those things. So one of the gals in the office, she does yoga, and she started like helping us do stretches during the day. And then she got us into that laughing yoga and all these different techniques. So it turns out if other people are taking care of themselves, we can step it up in our own game. I was talking to this one woman one day and her phone went off and it gurgled. I'm like, what's that? And she's like, oh, that's my new app. She's like, I've had 3 urinary tract infections and I don't drink enough water. Like she was going around completely dehydrated and actually ended up in the hospital twice. And so the app was a gurgle to remind her to drink. And she's telling me this story and she still hadn't drank anything. I'm like, you need to drink your water. Like, go ahead and drink it. So the next one is also really, really important. We don't know everything. And so when we're starting out, it's really, really important that we have mentors and we have people who can teach us the ropes. And if there's not someone in your organization who does the same job as you, and maybe your supervisor can't even really help you, it's important to find out who your peer might be. Who else lives in the world that you could connect to? Like, to pick on you for a second, if you're in a shelter or, working with transitional youth, maybe there's a mentor working in Portland or who knows, right? And so figuring out who you can go to ask questions, because there is nothing more stressful than having a task in front of you and not having any idea where to start, right? And that's really even more critical when you're first starting out. We all need it in an ongoing way, but when I when I first moved from New York to Oregon, I started working in this skilled nursing facility, and this nurse came up to me and she said, "I just need you to know, we eat our young here." And you guys know what that means, right? It's like, don't expect any support, and you're gonna really have a challenge. And she was right, but I did find some support and a mentor, and ended up being there for 6 years. So you never know, right? Uh, it also turns out that seeing yourself as having multiple roles serves as a protective factor. And so, what that usually means is that if one part of your job is not going particularly well, you don't think you're horrible at it altogether, right? And so, there are certain parts of my job that I'm better at than others. I'm really willing to admit that. Doesn't mean I'm not stressed about it, though, right? So if we have a hard moment, it's important to realize all the other things that are going well and that you do well, and then work on that. But what do we mostly do is, in those areas that we're having a hard time with, we get really hard on ourselves, probably more than other people, right? So recognizing that you're bigger than any one thing. And we talked a little earlier about the importance of connection. Well, it turns out having ongoing and really meaningful relationships with friends and colleagues makes a huge difference. And so finding ways to make time to hang out is really important, both at the water cooler, as they say, and also after work or out and about. Um, Without relationships, as humans, we just don't do as well. Even for the introverts, it turns out there's still a way in which we need some connection and some reflection back of our goodness. Um, the next is a really important one, and one that people don't like to talk about very much. But again, we've all had lemons. Some have had a lot of lemons. And so if we don't work to sort out our stories, we are going to be activated all the time. The old word for that was triggered, right? I'm feeling triggered. This thing happens, and unconsciously, usually, we don't realize it's linked to something else that happened a long time ago. And so we usually have a big, scary response, either internally or externally. And so it's really important that we figure out those feelings that you're having are valid and mean something, and you need to find out what so you don't keep having them. Does that make sense? But that's a really big thought for a lot of people. And it's important to see, though, where those things might be impacting your current feeling of success. Like, I have a coworker actually who very vulnerably shared with me that she had started seeing a counselor, and the reason was because a couple of her friends didn't really want to hang out with her as much. And when she kind of confronted them, one of them said, "You just feel toxic. You're so negative," right? And she was horrified. I think she was trying to get support, but the reality was she was so far down in the hole. She had become very critical and judgmental. Stress brain, she's not a bad person. She's a very dear heart. However, when you're stressed, all those ugly things come out. That's why when I see someone being like not in a great place, it's like, wow, what's going on with them? Like, I really want to know more about their story, because people aren't normally like that when they're doing okay, right? And so she's got all these strategies. She's really stepping up her game at work. It's really a pleasure to watch people thrive and work through stuff. So if you're feeling like there's some ongoing things and you don't even really understand them, sometimes it's even figuring out what they're related to. Because a lot of times people in our present are paying a price for people in our past. My son Zach used to like that to watch that show Arrested Development. Any of you know that it's a silly, terrible show, but there's this one line that has stuck with me, and it's hurt people, right? And so if we're not in a place where we're feeling in balance, we can bring a lot of that to others. And if our relationships aren't going very well, we might need to check in with ourselves. Like that poor girl. I mean, I don't know how I'd feel if someone said, "You're just toxic," but maybe sometimes I am. I mean, maybe sometimes we all are. And we have to be aware of that. So the next thing the experts say is that learning and gaining more skills and knowledge is actually a huge benefit to renewing ourselves. That's why a lot of people like to go to conferences or workshops, because as we're gaining more skills and awareness, we feel better about ourselves. And usually there's also a networking piece, right? We're not alone when we're in a group of other people. So that can be a wonderful thing to think about. Like, if you really need to kind of recharge your batteries, maybe sign up for a class, maybe go to a workshop. You're here today, so you're already doing it. The next one is internal focus and locus of control. So what this means is we may not always have all the control over what's happening around us, but if we feel like we have some ability to make choices for ourselves and take action, no matter what's happening outside, that level of attention to what we need really is what we need to try to hold the space for. When we feel like everybody is going to make decisions on our behalf and we're being pulled in a lot of different directions and we don't have control, that's when our stress usually goes through the roof. So knowing that even in difficult situations, there's usually something you can do. Even if it's to say, whoa, my cup's overflowing and I need some support. Maybe even that's a good first step. And then the final one, and this was something I really needed to learn, was there are limits to our role, and it's okay to set boundaries. And sometimes we're the ones crossing the boundary, and we have to be aware of that. And how that showed up in my life was I went back to school and I got a master's and then a PhD, and I've got a lot of knowledge, it turns out, about kids with special needs. But I also am a parent educator. And when you work as a parent educator, you have a curriculum that you're supposed to follow with fidelity, right? So these families come and they're in your group and you're working with them. And what did I want to do? I wanted to do intervention. I wanted to put my special ed hat on. It's like, oh, this kid needs some support. And so I would say to my supervisor, we need to change what we're doing. These families need this different things. And they're like, gently reminding me, remember what your role is. You need to refer. And after a while, I finally got it. Okay, sometimes I can be the consultant, but sometimes I need to be the parent educator and not the consultant. And someone else can be the consultant for that kid. right? And so, whatever that means in your work, are there things, there's this old term scope creep, where we're creeping into other people's territories. So sometimes we're doing too much anyway. Like, where is it that we need to hand people back to themselves or say, hey, can I help you make a call for these other resources? Because it's not always our charge, right? And maybe they need a whole lot more than what you're able to give them, and that's actually slowing them down from really moving forward in the ways they really need to. So, all right. Make sense? It's a pretty good list. And I will say to those who want to learn more and follow some of these prescribed uh, recommendations, this comes from a book called The Resilient Practitioner. And you can buy it online on Amazon. But we've started using it at Portland State in the early, infant toddler mental health program, because what we realize is that for caregivers and people working with kids and families, if you don't learn to do good self-care, you're in trouble fast, right? So we take 3 terms and we study this and we really explore it. And so some of this is in that book. The book's just full of wonderful, wonderful ideas and strategies. Oops. All right. So the other thing I want to be very thoughtful about is how sometimes we get stressed when we don't feel like we have enough resources. Now, resources come in all shapes and sizes. Maybe we don't think we have enough funding, or maybe we don't have enough manpower or time, or whatever it is. And so, this is where we also have to do some thoughtful exploring about what we really need. Because, again, if we don't necessarily know where we're starting from, we don't always know how to move forward in asking or figuring it out. And the most important thing to realize is that you don't always need money. Now, that's a big thought, but the reason I say it is because we live in a world where there's millions of dollars being put into storage facilities, both for personal and professional use. And so, if we need like toys or clothes or anything like that, there's probably someone that would trade us or share with us or give them to us for our programs. And kids get bored of things anyway, so rotating through things is a wonderful thing to do. So sometimes it's just figuring out who may have a resource and borrow it or share it is a nice way to do it. Any thoughts on that? Are there any of you that are finding really good ways of trying to share resources or come up with creative ideas in your programs? Kind of a big thought to think about. Please.
I work at a middle school and run all the after school programs and stuff, but we're a nonprofit, so of course we don't have much money. So a bunch of years ago, I partnered with the food bank in town. And so now I go work like 2 or 3 hours on a Friday afternoon every week, and then they gave me all my snacks for all my programming.
That's great. You didn't hear what she said. So she said that she works in a school and there's not a lot of resources. And so she's partnering with a local food bank. Is food bank? Yeah. And she does a few hours of volunteer work and they provide snacks for all her programs. Yeah. And so sometimes it really is about who you know and how do you connect, because people have stuff. And the other thing that we know about how we feel better as humans is it turns out altruism gives us a huge whopping dose of dopamine and feel good chemicals in our brain. So by letting people give to you, which is not easy for a caregiver to receive, I know this from way back, but I'm learning that it makes people feel really, really good. So, again, make your wish list, figure out where you're at, and then be creative about how you might be able to move forward. Where there's a will, there is usually a way. So the other thing I want to highlight, I don't know if some of you work directly with parents or not, but for those that work with kids, what I'd like to just pause for a moment and talk about is how a lot of times individuals didn't come from backgrounds where they had a lot of support from their parents or caregivers. There wasn't a lot of active skill building. And so it's hard then when you become a parent to know what to do, right? And so sometimes the best thing you can do for other families that you know is really provide to them what you want them to provide to their children. So if you want them to be compassionate and patient and caring, being that to a parent is really, really important. And we can do that for each other too. It's not just about parenting by any means. But for so many people, what I've come to realize is that problem solving wasn't taught in the home. Good decision making, like all these life skills that really slow us down if we don't have them, weren't really taught. And so sometimes what we need to do is active skill building for adults who are around us so that they can then be in a better position to support their littles. Um, and so there's 5 different things that I found around parental intelligence. And we can do these too on a different level if we're not working with kids. But the first thing is when we're really feeling stressed or in a situation is step back. Sometimes we have to pause to move forward. But if we're just on that kind of reactive treadmill, things don't really work out very well. The second is do self reflection. You know, even if you try something, it's important to say, well, how did that go? And maybe it's, that didn't go very well, did it? And try something else. Any of you know the definition of insanity for AA? Doing the same thing again, expecting a different outcome. Gosh, we do that all the time, right? And so to be able to be in that state of self-reflection, you know, what's really going on here? And figuring out how you're feeling and what your role is in all of it, that's important. And especially if you're an adult caring for a child, because, gosh, that's hard work. Um, the third one is understanding your child's mind. You know, the first 3 to 5 years, kids will never think more differently than an adult, right? They have their own way of thinking. Like if you say to a kiddo, oh, your father's going to be late in picking you up because he's tied up at work. What does the child imagine? Ropes, gags, right? They can't do figurative speech or metaphors. They don't know time. Like all the things that we big people take for granted, they don't know. And so figuring out what children actually need goes a long way. And the fourth one is really critically important. It turns out most maltreatment of young children is directly related to expectations and not knowing enough about stages of development. So if you expect an 18-month-old to share, will you be disappointed? Very, right? But when you look at who's ending up in foster care and who's having the worst outcomes, it's usually our toddlers, right? So what's going on with the toddlers? Big feelings, not sharing, right? Not doing what the adult wants. And there's a high price that they're paying when the person who is trying to care for them doesn't understand what they need. And so it really behooves all of us in the village, whether you're working with children or not, to try to figure out how do we share more about what kids need and be an ally or a champion for children. Because a lot of times parents are so stressed themselves and may not know that their expectations exceed what the child can do. And the other thing I would mention with that, just because a child can do something one day, or an adult, you could even use this for, can do something one day, like cope with a problem, doesn't mean the next day they're not going to melt down. And it doesn't mean that it's within their control. It means they're just overwhelmed in that moment. And so we have to start over and provide support. And then the final one is problem solving. And this is a big one because when there's so much conflict in the world, usually it has a lot to do with people not being able to effectively communicate and connect with each other. Um, and the first step in problem solving is actually identifying what the problem is. Otherwise, we're very codependent, and it usually goes like this: if you would just change, I'd be better, right? So, figuring out what's actually happening and what each person wants or needs, and trying some things out goes a long way. I was actually working with a couple with a new baby, and they were just really, really fighting a lot. And he was taking some extra hours in the evening to make a little more money. She was staying home with their daughter, and things just got really hot and was really going sideways. And so it's like, okay, so let's work our steps here. What's the actual problem? Any of you guess what the actual problem was for them? Hmm? So there might have been some of that, but that's not the actual problem. That was part of the issue, but not the root of it. Underappreciated. Nope. They didn't expect the baby to act like that. Nope. They didn't spend enough time together. That is exactly right. They missed each other. And you know what's really sad is that so often the problems that we have with people is because we really want to be with them and we either fear loss or we're struggling with something. But the truth is, they really missed each other, right? And so they came up with a couple of ideas. She said, "I got to get out of the house. Let's let grandma watch the kiddo and let's go on a date every Friday night." And he said, yeah, that would be nice, but I don't actually have to be to work till 9 a.m. How about we have a big breakfast and then we can spend time together every day?" So guess which one they chose? Both. Yeah, you can do both, right? It doesn't have to be a win-lose. So once you know what the actual issue is, for them it was all about connecting and really caring for each other. There's lots of ways to be together and figure it out, even if he does have to put in more time, which helps stabilize the family economically. So the parallel process and strength-based approach is really about, modeling and supporting adults so that they can then better be there for kiddos. And we always want to start with people's strengths. What happens if we go into a situation and like point out all the things that we think they're doing wrong? How long do you think we'll be able to enjoy their company? Not very long, it turns out. But if you look, usually people are doing a lot of things right, and they need to actually hear that and be validated for it. And that's true for ourselves too. Like all the things that we're doing really well, sometimes we don't think about our strengths. We think about what? Our deficits. So I love this quote: collaboration is not about gluing together existing egos. It's about the ideas that never existed until everyone entered the room. So we need to learn to work together. We're not all going to have all of the answers, but many hands make light work, right? There's all these expressions about how we need to figure out a way to move forward, and that's usually getting ideas. So, communication is such a big part of the process. And again, a lot of us didn't learn this in the home, right? There might have been really poor models of communication. Um, I love Dr. Gottman's work. I don't know if you know him, he's great, but he has a love lab up at UW. And he talks about the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And those are things like when you're communicating with your partner, being critical, being defensive, stonewalling, which means you're not going to talk, or contempt. And in all relationships, a lot of those communication things happen. But in healthy relationships, contempt can't ever happen. You guys know what contempt is? So it's usually kind of feeling superior and being really, really, I would say, abusive with somebody else, just really treating them badly. So he brings couples into the Love Lab, and within, I don't know if the sessions are like 20 minutes, however long they are, he can tell with 96% accuracy which couples are going to stay together. Guess what he uses to measure it? Eye rolling is the guess. Posture, nonverbal. Yeah, so it turns out it's really they count up how many positive exchanges to negative exchanges. So all of those things you're describing can be a form of communication, right? So when your partner makes a bid for attention, like you go to the window and you see a yellow bird out there and say, "Oh, I see a yellow bird." If they stay on their phone texting, that's a negative, right? But if they say, "Oh, what kind of bird is it?" Or better yet, even go and look out the window with you, that's a positive. And it turns out, in order to stay together and be healthy and happy, you need 5 to 1, 5 positives for every negative. That's a lot because our brains are actually wired with what they call the negativity bias. So we remember the one slight or roll of their eye, right? But do we remember, oh, they made us a sandwich or made us some tea? So we need a lot more of the positives. And that turns out to be true for kids as well. And so, as teachers and parents, 5 to 1 is a good rule too. Okay, so earlier the expert said one of the strategies for feeling a sense of renewal is learning or learning something new. So this is something I'd like you to consider as a form of self-care. And there's lots of ways to learn things. You can try something out, you can read a book, you can talk to someone. I don't know if you can see all the images. The one that's a little frightening is the facing the fears. I'm not advocating you go and be stood up at gunpoint to like learn something. It's funny they put that, but so let's just take just a short moment to think about what's something you've always wanted to learn about, or is there something you're currently learning about? I shared with you I'm starting to take that art class. Um, so is there something you're learning about or you'd like to? So let's just take a quick minute to share with your neighbor. What can you do to continue your own learning? And it can be personal or professional. All right, let's come back together. And it's okay if you can't think of something right now, but I do hope as you go forward, you do a little bit of self-reflecting. What are some things you've always been interested in and really want to do? It really makes a huge difference when we're pursuing new things. It helps our brain. So the idea here is that usually we do know what we need, but we don't always do it. So this happened in Springfield, which is, I'm in Eugene. We had a little earthquake a few years ago, and it says, "We will rebuild." And that was about the extent of it. Some of our lawn furniture fell over. I was sitting in my chair, and I have squirrels that often use my roof, and the trees are in the front and backyard to run across. And I heard this vroom, and I'm like, oh, it must have been a lot of squirrels. That was the extent of the earthquake. But that's so true of life. Usually, we know what we need. We just don't always take the steps that is necessary to be able to follow through. So Goethe says, knowing is not enough, we must apply. Willing is not enough, we must do. And here's where our own self-responsibility really starts to show up. So it turns out we have some choices to make. And the more we can empower ourselves to do the things that move us forward, the better we feel. So as a non-example, I will share with you, when I was a little girl, whether I was having a good day or a bad day, but usually a bad day, my dad really hated to see me sad, and so he would take me to the donut shop. And I loved cupcakes, and I'm trying to change that narrative because I still love cupcakes. But I love this. Stress spelled backwards is desserts, right? And so that's a quick fix. And we all have quick fixes. But what happens about an hour or two after I eat the cupcake? I feel terrible. I actually feel more stressed, it turns out. I feel sugar, once I start getting away from it, sugar really is not good. Yes, that's true. It's true. It's a circular solution. And so part of the journey is really about us trying to find where we are in following our callings in this life. And so this is a nice little Venn diagram or image where it says, if you love it, if the world needs it, if you're paid for it, and you're great at it, right where all of those things connect, that's your purpose. Now, some of us are getting close, like we might have a vocation, so we're paid for it, we're professionals. Some of us are great at it, and it might be profession, but if you really love something, that's where you're going to thrive. And they say you never work a day in your life. You really love what you do. Like, I love being here with you today. This is not work for me. Tomorrow, when I go back and have to do a grant report, terrible work, terrible, very stressful. I'll need a cupcake. No. So here's 3 simple rules for life that I'd like you to think about. If you do not go after what you want, you'll never have it. And this is something I had to learn the hard way. You know, you keep waiting for someone to open a door or tell you about an opportunity. And even if you know the things that you want, if you don't actually take the steps, it's not going to happen. If you do not ask, the answer will always be no. And if you do not step forward, you'll always be in the same place. And so here are the actionable items that we need to consider. So here's some questions that I'm not going to have you necessarily talk about today, but I'd like you to think about as you go forward. And maybe if you journal or you're open to writing, you might spend a little bit of time pen to paper. But what actually helps you? Like, what motivates you? What are you passionate about? What gets you out of bed in the morning, aside from your cat wanting fancy feast? But these are the things that are going to really help you with self-care, because when you're building your dreams or going after what you want or living your truth, you just feel better. Even if it's really, really hard work, it makes you feel better. So I want to just, as we're kind of winding down, talk more specifically about the research and what strategies are found to be really helpful for humans. So there's a lot of research coming out right now about nature. Turns out whether you have too much energy or too little energy, if you're in nature, it stabilizes you. I don't know if it's the negative ions or I don't know how it all works. It's kind of magical. But in Japan, this has become such an important part of things. The doctors are actually prescribing what they call nature bathing. Go out and be in nature. And so if you have a lot of stress, this is a wonderful, wonderful strategy. I don't think we're outside enough, personally. The other thing the research is showing is that having a sense of humor and laughter is actually a coping skill. You know, I've known some people in my life that have had really, really hard early beginnings, but they're really funny. Like, are they faking it? Like, how can you be that funny and have had that many lemons? Well, it turns out this is what got them through it. If you like stand-up comedy at all, if you know the backgrounds of those, folks, you realize coping strategy. Really important for kids. The more we get them laughing, the more it releases all these feel-good chemicals in the brain. And I've talked about this quite a bit already, but I can't say enough about social connection. When I was working with the elderly, there was some research being done at the time where it had people doing visits to nursing homes and connection, especially with young kids. And it really improved people's depression, anxiety, all of that. Now some places are actually putting preschools in nursing homes, which I think is, kind of duh. Why didn't we think of this before? Right? And so no matter where you are on the circle of life, we need connection. And, a lot of times it's like, oh, don't touch people. There's all these fears around it, but we absolutely need to touch each other. Should be safe touch, gentle touch. But we need connection, and it's important to find that. And I love her. So it makes a huge difference for people who are kind of living their best lives because you can tell in the face of somebody and in kind of the twinkle in their eye how they're doing, right? And so it's really great to be around people who've kind of found that inner beauty, and they can teach you a lot. And maybe you're that person for people around you. And so we kind of have a choice whether we're going to light up a room or be the toxic friend, I guess. So, with your neighbor, I don't know if you all have things to write with or if one of you does, but I'd like to give you a 1 minute brainstorm challenge where we come up with as many self care strategies as we can think of. You guys ready? Go. Stop. That's a minute. So count up how many you came up with, and let's see how we ended up. Who thinks you have quite a bit? You have 7? Who can beat 7? How many? 8. Anyone beat 8? 11. Great. Any more than that? You have 11 too? Okay, great. So would anyone be willing to list off a few? And I could probably just echo. So what are some of the things on your list? Where's my 11 people? What's on your list?
We've got walking, outdoors, concerts, music, reading, relaxing, pets, socializing, self-reflection, talking to your neighbors, gardening.
Oh, great. Any other ones anyone would like to add to that? That's a great list. What's that? Did I hear one?
Camping.
Camping. Camping is a wonderful
Having
thing.
tea, having chocolate, dark chocolate.
Dark chocolate. Dancing.
We got so many things. We got self-reflection, drinks like lots of water, meditation, yoga, write things down, have a cup of tea, painting, relaxing, cleaning the house, organizing, walking. What else do we have? We have painting, listening to relaxed music.
Great. Those are all
Yeah.
fabulous. And do you notice the lists are different, right? And that's the one thing that's really important to understand. Stress is a very individual experience, right? What stresses me out may not be the same stressor for the next person. In fact, probably won't be. And so self-care strategies are also going to be really tied specifically to you, where, I might get really exhilarated jumping out of a plane. That might like make someone else want to go to the bathroom, right? So figuring that out is important, like what works for you. The research says the top 5 stress busters, and I think you got them all. It's rest, getting enough sleep. We mostly run a deficit in our country right now. Diet, which I would say also includes water and hydration. Exercise, being active can make you feel loads better. And then meditation and humor. Not necessarily hard things we have to do anyway, but can we do them more mindfully is the question. So if you Google 50 ways to take a break, this image will come up. If you want it for yourself, you can print it out and have it near you. But a lot of the things that you listed are also on here. So great minds think alike. So art and camping and dance and all of those great things. So what's important for you to realize, it's not the 2 weeks in the Virgin Islands that's going to really be the best form of self-care. That'd be nice. But it's the day in and day out little things that you do that helps you feel better, right? So drinking your water, doing your walks, petting your cat. It's all those little things that add up to really big things. So I want to leave you with a little inspiration by Marianne Williamson. Are some of you familiar with her? She's, kind of a self-help spiritual gal. She wrote this really great book some years back called A Woman's Worth. And part of that book that has always stuck with me since I read it is she says, if your value is based on doing, how can you ever do enough? Right? And so what her challenge was then, maybe that shouldn't be our measure. And that's going to take a cultural shift because it's almost like we have badges of honor, right? How tired are we? How many things are we doing? How much are we giving of ourselves? And if you have coworkers that aren't saying those things, what do you think they are? Slacking, lazy, right? Like we don't, in our culture, we don't necessarily promote self-care and balance. So it's important to really question what we value and why, and start a whole new revolution is my goal. But part of the reason I think we don't necessarily do the things that we need to do is we may not know we're worthy of it or that we need to do it on some much deeper level. So I'm going to read you this piece, and it's been around for a while, but I don't know if you've heard it. But she writes, our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, fabulous? Actually, who are you not to be? You're a child of God. Your playing small does not serve the world. There's nothing enlightened about shrinking so that other people won't feel insecure around you. We are all meant to shine like children do. We are born to make manifest the glory of God that is within us. It's not just in some of us, it's in everyone. And as we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same. As we're liberated from our own fear, our presence automatically liberates others. Pretty powerful. So we do have these for you to take with you today. So it's important to recognize that sometimes it's about really claiming all of who we are in all of our glory and all of our goodness and running with that. So in the next couple of minutes, think about, is there at least one thing that you can think of right now that you might be able to change, that you feel is kind of outworn, doesn't work for you, isn't working to bring you the things you want, to see maybe some new possibilities emerging. So we'll just take a couple of minutes again, your final task with your neighbor, and see, is there something from our talk this morning that you might want to change, you might want to do differently, that you think might have some added value, okay? And then we'll come back one last time before we close. All right, let's come back together one last time. So I'm not going to ask you what those things are, but with a show of hands, does everybody have one thing at least? Yes? Anybody not have anything they feel like they can do on their own behalf? Because I'll stay after. All right. So thank you. And please remember, you know all those things you've always wanted to do? You should go do them. All right. Thank you and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.